Italy, 1947. 2 years since the war's end. Poverty plagues much of the country. Fertile ground for communism, which promises a solution to economic ills and injustice.
Life was extremely hard. Besides the political tensions, there was always a sense of having to tighten your belt. We were hungry. We were always hungry.
As membership of the Communist Party reaches 2 million, America fears that Italy and Western Europe could fall to communism.
The seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and war. They spread and grow in the evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of the people for a better life has died. We must keep that hope alive.
May Day in Moscow, 1947. The Red Army was the largest fighting force in the world. Stalin had established control over most of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union offered an alternative model for society, public ownership and a centrally planned economy, in contrast to the Western belief in a mixed economy and free trade.
There was great alarm at the deteriorating political and economic situation and fear that the domestic communists in Western Europe would become so active and so disruptive that it would lead to economic collapse, which was probably going to happen anyway unless something was done. And this would give an opportunity to the Soviets to extend their influence in Western Europe.
In February 1947, a financial crisis forced the British government to tell Washington they were ending aid to Greece and Turkey. The administration feared the Eastern Mediterranean might fall to communism. Truman used this opportunity to take the offensive.
The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedoms. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
I was there in the balcony listening, and I was struck by the absolute concentrated attention of the Congress. On this occasion, everyone in the hall realized that this was a major historical event.
I therefore ask the Congress to provide authority for assistance to Greece and Turkey in the amount of $400 million for the period ending June 30th, 1948.
Truman pitched the struggle for the first time as between freedom and tyranny, the West and communists. Truman had to persuade the often isolationist Congress to act. The anti-communism of the Truman Doctrine did just that.
The Truman speech reflected very clearly Truman's own character. He liked to see issues very clearly and to come up with clean-cut answers.
After 5.5 years of a war to defeat fascism, Europe was bankrupt. Industry lay in ruins. Homes were in rubble. People struggled to survive. The Communist Party, which had fought fascism, attracted new recruits
The appeal of communism to young people and to students was that of a hope that it was possible to create a classless society. Many people believed that communism was going to create a better world, better than the one that existed before the war. This was the only party that you could join if you wanted to change the world.
The man called on by Truman to face the communist threat was the newly appointed Secretary of State, General Marshall, the wartime military leader. He would plan the United States response.
Marshall was an extraordinary man. I've never known anything like him. He, in many respects, was a very austere, unapproachable man. He never allowed anyone to call him George Marshall, including the president. When the president asked him if he should, he said no, General Marshall will do. He exuded leadership and character.
In March, Marshall met Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov at a meeting in Moscow. Britain and France were there too. The Big Four tried to agree on the future of Germany. Despite warm Russian hospitality, weeks of meetings got nowhere.
Marshall made one last effort. He had an interview with Stalin in the Kremlin, and that interview convinced Marshall that what the Soviets were doing were stalling for time in order for the situation in Western and Central Europe to become more and more adverse, so that popular unrest would become greater and greater, the communists would grow in strength, and that maybe communist regimes would come to power in Western Europe without the Red Army having to invade.
At the heart of Europe's problems lay the question of a defeated Germany. Stalin wanted to keep Germany on its knees, concerned that otherwise it would rise up one day and threaten the Soviet Union again. The Americans believed that Germany must get back on its feet before there could be a full European recovery. Marshall was now convinced of the need to act quickly. On his return from Moscow, he instructed the State Department to begin preparing ideas for a European rescue plan. Billions of dollars would be needed. Would Congress approve this enormous cost?
The whole situation is critical in the extreme. We happen to be, very fortunately for ourselves, the strongest nation in the world today, certainly economically.
The urgency was such that Marshall rushed forward his plan.
There will be requirements in this program.
He announced it at an awards ceremony at Harvard University. There were no film cameras present. Marshall proposed aid to Europe on a vast scale and invited the Europeans to respond. Ernest Bevin, the British Foreign Secretary, immediately realized the importance of Marshall's speech. He had always wanted to involve the Americans in European reconstruction.
When Marshall made his big speech in Harvard, Bevin seized upon it, and bringing the French in at the same time, welcomed it, and out of that they built up what became the European Recovery Program and the recovery of Western Europe.
The Soviet economy also desperately needed investment to make up for the ravages of 4 years of war on Russian soil. In theory, the Marshall Plan was open to both East and West, but would Stalin participate?
Stalin was always suspicious, and he wasn't keen on it from the very start. He said, "Just you watch it. The situation is quite different from the wartime Lend-Lease American assistance to us. With the Truman Doctrine in place as well, They don't really want to help us. They just want to tear the people's democracies away from our sphere of influence, to win them over, to infiltrate them, to pull them away from the Soviet Union.
In Paris, a foreign ministers' conference opened to frame the European response to the Marshall Plan. Despite Stalin's caution, Molotov and a large Soviet delegation turned up at the conference table.
Molotov listened to all the reports and proposals, although he felt it was clearly not that straightforward, that the aid would be tied up with certain conditions.
Throughout the Cold War, spies were used by both sides. At this critical point, spies in London were passing their Soviet controllers document after document.
Dozens. I mean, all the diplomatic going in and out from the Foreign Office, we had access to everything.
After 6 days of meetings in Paris, Soviet intelligence gave Stalin new information about the Marshall Plan.
Our intelligence service knew everything. We've read all the documents which were produced by United States, by the government of the United States, which was sent to almost all European countries, including the government of the Soviet Union, but and other documents which were not sent to the Soviet Union.
This information confirmed that America didn't really want us to participate in it. They just made this demonstrative gesture in order not to scare away those already dealing with them. Stalin abruptly told Molotov to pull out of the negotiations.
As Molotov left the Paris meeting, he accused the West of dividing Europe into two hostile camps.
There never was any thought that the Soviets would actually join the Marshall Plan, but it was a desirable step to persuade the world that we really were being altruistic here. This was not basically an anti-communist, anti-Soviet measure. And should, by some miracle, the Soviets themselves join, or some of their satellite countries, we would have welcomed them in it. But we didn't think that was a realistic possibility.
In Prague, the Czechoslovaks discussed whether to join the Marshall Plan. In the democratically elected government, a third of the ministers were communists.
The reactions were absolutely positive. Even the communist ministers in the government, in the Czechoslovak government, agreed with our participation in Paris. That means to attend the conference to prepare the Marshall Plan. The decision of the Czechoslovak government was absolutely unanimous.
Stalin summoned the Czech Prime Minister, Klement Gottwald, to Moscow. With him came the Foreign Minister, Jan Masaryk. They arrived on the afternoon of July 9th and waited.
It was about 11 o'clock in the evening, that means before midnight. Somebody came that they should immediately go over to Kremlin. But the principal question put before them was that the Czechoslovak delegation shouldn't go over to Paris to attend to the conference on the Marshall Plan.
Stalin said, if by 4 a.m. on the 11th of July you have not refused to attend, then be prepared. This will have serious consequences on our relations with you.
Stalin was quite clear, quite rough, and he gave the ultimatum of 4 hours to our delegation to say their decision. Finally, the same government which accepted unanimously the presence in Paris rejected it. As far as the Marshall Plan is concerned, there was no normal discussion. There was practically only a quite clear order. You have to do it, and if you do not do it, so you are not our friends. You are betraying the Union, Soviet Union, and so on and so on. So this was quite clear.
When the Czech delegation left Moscow, Gottwald read a prepared statement. He couldn't hide his discomfort.
Народы станут еще крепче. Поэтому да здравствует вечная дружба и союз Советского Союза и Чехословакии, да здравствует героический советский народ и его великий вождь генералиссимус Сталин.
Jan Masaryk was shattered by the experience.
When he came out from the plane, he said quite clearly, I was going to Moscow as a minister of a free state, and I am returning as Stalin's slave.
In September 1947, 16 European nations signed up for the Marshall Plan and requested $20 billion of aid. The Western Alliance began to take shape. The battle lines of the Cold War were being drawn.
The primary purpose was compassionate goodwill, the notion that our former allies needed to have the help of the United States.
План Маршалла Советским Союзом расценивался.
The policy of the Marshall Plan was seen in the Soviet Union as the Americans wanting to impose their influence over the countries to which they gave Marshall aid. The Soviet Union could not accept that, believing it to be an aggressive act on behalf of the Americans. That is why the Marshall Plan was never accepted in our country.
That September 1947, Stalin revived the pre-war Communist International as the Cominform. Through it, Stalin planned to control the countries of the Eastern Bloc. He also instructed communist parties in the West to take the initiative in seizing power. In American propaganda, the Cominform was represented as a sinister, shadowy conspiracy of evil. But its economic associate, Comecon, offered Russian aid to Eastern Bloc countries, sending grain to Czechoslovakia after a bad harvest.
Both Cominform and Comecon were a direct response to the Marshall Plan. On the one hand, the Cominform would follow the political, ideological line the Soviet Union wanted to adopt in the socialist countries. On the other hand, the aim of Comecon was to provide economic assistance in order to prevent these countries from being torn from our sphere of influence.
February 1948, the Communists reach for power in Czechoslovakia. Workers' militias go on the march. Non-communists are arrested. Action committees take over the police and the labor unions. President Beneš capitulates. The red flag flies in the center of Prague. In just 5 days, the communists took over Czechoslovakia's government. Stalin's rule was imposed on the Czechs. Two weeks later, Jan Masaryk fell to his death from the window of his apartment in Prague. The argument still rages. Did he despair and jump, or was he pushed? Masaryk was the son of Thomas Masaryk, the founder of the Czech state. His funeral symbolized the end of a free Czechoslovakia.
After the death of the minister, and there were really tens of thousands of people who were coming to say farewell to the minister, the last farewell. They were crying and flowers and so on and so on. But the general persuasion was that there was really the end. We felt it like that, unfortunately.
The communist takeover in Prague shocked Washington. There, the case for martial aid was still being argued before a partly isolationist Congress.
The Soviet Union and its agents have destroyed the independence and democratic character of a whole series of nations in Eastern and Central Europe. It is this ruthless course of action and the clear design to extend it to the remaining free nations of Europe that have brought about the critical situation in Europe today.
It was touch and go when both houses of Congress were finally considering the legislation. Then the Czech coup occurred, and that was the final straw, because even the isolationists, or most of them, could see that the Russians were advancing westward with the takeover in Czechoslovakia and so on. So it helped very importantly to pass the legislation.
On April 3, 1948, Congress approved $5 billion of martial aid. The Marshall Plan was born from the need to feed the hungry and to prevent communism spreading over Europe. "20% of the aid were loans, 80% grants. The first shipments were foods and fertilizers. Next, machines to improve agricultural efficiency. In the 4 years of the plan, the Marshall Agency spent $13.5 billion in 16 countries.
Fewer people spent more money in that agency than ever before or since in the United States government. It was an extraordinary performance.
Europe's purchase of American goods and machinery redirected many Marshall Aid dollars back into American industry, fueling a post-war boom.
Most people I knew felt that the generosity of Americans was a self-serving one, in the sense that they thought of Europe as an outlet for their goods, as a market to export stuff. And we thought that we could see that in the types of things that they wanted us to buy with the money that they lent us.
One of the countries most in need of help was Greece, devastated by the Nazi occupation and years of civil war. In the north, government troops still hunted out communist guerrillas.
Greece, of course, emerged from the war in a terrible state. Probably 2,000 of the nation's villages had been razed and burnt to the ground by the reprisal raids of the Nazis. The consequence of the Civil War was to add to that terribly shredded kind of social fabric.
During the 4 years of the Marshall Plan, Greece received nearly $700 million of economic assistance. Young Americans were thrust into positions of heavy responsibility.
I was the youngest member of the Marshall Plan mission in Greece. I arrived there at the age of 23, and to my astonishment, a year later, at age 24, there I was in charge of the Greek import program. The range of projects which we engaged in were all over the map and all over every single sector of the economy. And one could say that America fed and fueled and clothed the Greek nation.
In the hill villages of northern Greece emerging from civil war, the Marshall planners came up with a scheme to meet a local need.
During the war and during the Civil War, one of the major elements destroyed was the farm draft animal. One of the decisions was to import that which we were accustomed to, which was the Missouri mule. And the Missouri mule is not only cantankerous, he's big.
American mules arrived in Greece after a long sea voyage.
The village leaders informed us about the mules. We went down to the cooperative in Xanthi, and that's where they gave us the mules.
The farmers drew lots.
You took a piece of paper with the number of the mule written on it. Then you went to the overseer. He looked at your paper and gave the mule with that number to you. And then he said, "Take it."
The only problem was that the American mules were very much larger than the animals local farmers were used to.
The mules were very good. They were a bit wild, but slowly we got them under control. They were fat and big, and we began to use the mules to plough.
They were very good. They gave me a superb mule, and we started to plough.
The American mules were best. They were from the stable, well-fed and fat. You could put 200 kilos on them, and they could take it. Our own mules were small. We were very thankful. How could we not be thankful, since we had nothing? Long live America.
Industrial Europe faced other problems. France, 1947. Workers at the Renault factory near Paris went on strike. When communist ministers backed them, they were expelled from the government. Several months of disruption followed. Strikes spread. In the fall, 3 million workers took to the streets.
We had a lot of sympathy for the strikers because we felt that they were poorly paid, and we felt that the government wouldn't do anything for them unless they put pressure on the government.
Ministers feared civil war. The United States made it clear to Paris that there would be no Marshall aid to French industry until the government had the communist threat under control. Acts of sabotage culminated in the derailing of an express train, causing 20 deaths. The strikers lost popular support. The disruption ended. The French Fourth Republic would now receive Marshall aid, $2.7 billion of it. Yugoslavia had gone communist at the end of the war, without help from Moscow. The Yugoslav leader, Tito, became an ally of Stalin. But it was an uneasy alliance.
Tito, in Stalin's view, was acquiring more and more an independent position in various ways, including international affairs. Tito didn't consult or seek advice from Stalin in advance. He was moving further and further away from the socialist direction.
The split came in 1948 when Stalin expelled Tito from the Cominform. Following the rift, Tito turned to the West. After a series of disastrous harvests, Tito requested American economic assistance. In 1950, he signed an agreement with the United States government. Yugoslavia emerged from behind the Iron Curtain. American agents distributed more than $150 million worth of aid.
This was not totally an altruistic effort. The United States had enormous self-interest in the success of the Marshall Plan. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been undertaken. America had a vital stake in the recovery of Western Europe. If the United States had allowed Europe to collapse, it would have cost us much more than what we spent on the Marshall Plan. We were doing well by doing good.
But as well as doing good, Washington was preparing other tactics. In Italy, by 1948, the Communist Party, led by Togliatti, dominated the left-wing Popular Front. The Christian Democrats, led by De Gasperi, ran the government. In April, the first general election since the war raised expectations of a communist victory through the ballot box.
Io mi aspettavo che il Fronte Popolare,
I expected the Popular Front, the union of all the parties of the left, to win the election. This union of the left had to get together to counterbalance the Christian Democrats and the forces of the right.
Some Italians feared a communist victory.
That election could have been a touch-and-go election between Italy saying on one side of the world or the other side of the world. First of all, I think it would have been a tragedy for Italy, but I think it would have been a tragedy for Europe, I think it would have been a tragedy for the Mediterranean, and it would have been a setback for America.
In the United States, a campaign was orchestrated to persuade Italian Americans to write to relatives urging them not to vote communist. 10 million letters were sent.
Dear cousin Maria, have you thought what a communist victory would mean for Italy? It would be terrible.
Italy would be ruled direct from the Kremlin. Look what happened in Czechoslovakia.
You must realize how serious the situation is. You should see what the papers are saying.
Please,
here.
Listen to us. I urge you not to vote communist in the elections. Your cousin, Luigi.
Fu un'iniziativa molto intelligente perché arrivava direttamente alle famiglie.
It was a very intelligent initiative because it got through to the families directly.
Mezzo secolo di emigrazione.
After half a century of emigration, there were hundreds of thousands of Italian families in America.
In America e quindi ricevere.
So, to receive a letter of encouragement from them, a letter stating that they shouldn't vote for the Communist Party, well, that was very influential.
Letter writing was not enough. The newly created CIA decided to take the offensive.
What the CIA needed was authority to develop a program of covert action. General Marshall knew that the situation in Italy was critical. The largest communist party in the world outside of the Soviet Empire. Not having an organization and knowing that the State Department could not achieve the things that he knew had to be done, he personally said, we must explore the means of getting authority to carry out a covert action program that would challenge this tremendous communist threat.
This led to a debate in the young CIA. Did it have the legal authority to carry out covert operations? CIA lawyers studied the wording of the new National Security Act.
If the President of the National Security Council, the head of the National Security Council, is the President of the United States, and if he specifically directs the CIA under Hillenkotter to carry out operations to help Democratic parties
And if the Congress that was put in, if the Congress gives the money to support such a thing, then the authority is there. And that was the green light.
The CIA then intervened. It began covert operations in support of anti-communists and of the Christian Democrat Party.
I was in that branch of the CIA at the time that had to rush into the breach without training in covert action. And we had bags of money that we delivered to selected politicians to defray their political expenses, their campaign expenses, for posters, for pamphlets.
Io direttamente non sono a conoscenza di questo.
Personally, I'm not aware of that. It was spoken of, but I don't know anything about it, because I was never directly involved in party affairs.
The Church, too, mounted a powerful campaign against the communists.
Pope Pius XII was very concerned about the Communist Party. Not so much about their politics. He was concerned about their doctrine. And as Pope, Pius XII had to be concerned about what was happening in Italy at the time.
A network of election committees was created. They worked in close parallel to the organization of the Catholic Church.
I can say that all the parties envied our electoral structure, and especially the creation of election posters. In the rural areas, there were no cinemas. It was unthinkable at that time. So we had this idea. We sent some lorries out into towns and villages, and we projected the films at night, electioneering films. When we showed those films, everybody used to rush to the square where the films were projected. They were always very crowded.
They unleashed this tremendous campaign against the left, against the communists, against the socialists, and they told the most terrible lies about them. Things out of this world. The Church had a great influence over the people because 90% of them were Catholics and members of the Church.
At that particular time, I was a practicing Catholic. I was extremely rigorous about attending Mass. I never missed it. One Sunday I went to Mass, and the priest was preaching from the pulpit. And he said one sentence which struck me very deeply at the time. I still remember it. He said that the war against the communists was a holy war.
Pope Pius XII and the Catholic Church had supported the fascists throughout decades of rule. But the Vatican totally opposed communism. Just days before the election, Pius XII excommunicated many members of the Italian Communist Party.
When I heard about it, I was terribly upset. To begin with, there was the fact that at the time I was engaged to my fiancé. We were getting married the next year, and this meant we couldn't get married in church.
Pope Pius XII excommunicated us.
Ufficialmente come pontefice,
communists and the friends of communists.
Gli amici dei comunisti.
Not being able to marry in church meant I couldn't wear a white dress and have all the flowers, have the music playing. My uncle, who had been like a father to me when I was a child, couldn't even take me to the altar. Not to mention that as a Catholic, I very much believed that my marriage had to be blessed by the priest, who represented Christ on earth. And this was what I believed in.
You know that Pius XII, in one of his speeches, said you were either for Christ or against Christ. And the Communist Party was against Christ. They were clearly atheists. So, it was a duty of the Pope and of the Church to protect their people. So there was no other protection on the part of the Church but to organize all the Christian movements to oppose the Communist Party.
On April 18, 1948, Italy went to the polls. The Christian Democrats won a landslide victory. Italy would remain a member of the Western Alliance. The Communist share of the vote was almost halved.
Ho pianto moltissimo.
I cried so much.
Perché
we'd worked so hard to win this battle.
un risultato di
It had been such an effort.
insomma questo confronto.
I remember crying and crying and crying.
Pianto moltissimo, insomma.
La vittoria fu superiore a quello che
The victory was even greater than we had expected. It was the only time when we, on our own as Christian Democrats, had an absolute majority in Parliament.
Parlamento.
The CIA, too, drew its conclusions from the election victory.
Well, it was very gratifying. We didn't know at that time that we had carried out the first political action, covert political action program in the history of American intelligence that would be followed by many, many, many more.
Now that Italy had elected to stay in the Western Bloc, the United States released a flood of Marshall aid. In Turin, the Fiat Motor Company received giant new assembly line machines from Detroit and Pittsburgh. Fiat was re-equipped with some of the most sophisticated machinery in Europe. Fiat's recovery would fuel the revival of Italian industry.
In Europe and in Italy especially, we thought of America as all-powerful. They had 50% of the world GNP, they had all the modern technology, they'd beaten the Nazi system, and I don't say that you didn't expect it, but we were pleasantly surprised to see the generosity of their foreign policy. And the generosity of their foreign policy at that moment was expressed through the Marshall Plan.
The Marshall Plan also demonstrated the United States' desire to secure Europe's future. The message was, modernize your economies, and you too can be like us.
The Americans were trying to impose American ideas, American organization into Europe. There was a feeling that if the European economies were to be rebuilt, if Europe was to be competitive in the world economy again, it would have to imitate American production methods, American management methods, and so on. And many European businessmen were eager to do this.
In those years, I mean the immediate post-war years, the whole of Europe was in a recession. So first of all, it helped us step out of a recession. It gave us a certain amount of speed to the economy. But that was the first step. The second real step that was it approached this European community on the whole. It brought us towards NATO, and it brought the European countries closer to each other and to the United States.
The Marshall Plan set out to build a European consumer society. The United States wanted a free enterprise Western bloc, peaceful, united, and tied to American trade and capital. The Soviet Union was forced to build its own rival bloc. The people of the socialist countries would eye the West for 40 years and wonder. In 1945, British and American pilots had rained death and destruction on Germany. Now, in 1948, they were flying again to Berlin. This time, we're keeping the city alive. Berliners were a beaten people in 1945. Their fate was in the hands of the Russians, Americans, British and French, their conquerors. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones: Soviet, American, British and French. 3.5 million Berliners lived in a city 110 miles behind the Russian lines. Berlin was linked to the west by a highway and a railway which ran through the Soviet zone. The city itself was divided into 4 sectors: Soviet, American, British and French.
Я вам рассказывал. Потому что именно в Берлине и в самой Германии
Berlin and Germany were the only places where the two sides came into contact. That is, Soviet troops and troops from the Allied countries.
Граница и в Берлине тоже. В других местах мы нигде не имели прямого.
In other places, we didn't have direct contact between our two armed forces.
Это была одна из причин того.
That was one of the reasons why Berlin became a battlefield for the Cold War.
Вот этой холодной войны.
Berliners had lived precarious existence for years. Food was at near starvation levels and currency was worthless. Black market was king.
Man tauschte also und das, was man auf
We bartered everything.
Ich will mal sagen, wer nicht raucht.
A non-smoker who got cigarettes with his ration cards would gladly take them, because he could barter them for something more useful.
Anders der Raucher war gegen irgendwas anderes ein.
Naturally, we all did it. Cigarettes were our currency.
Das war die Zigarette.
The black market was the only thing that kept us alive.
Was die Leute am Leben erhält.
British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin had a plan for Germany. He didn't like the Germans, but believed that European recovery depended on them.
We have to try and recreate Germany on a democratic basis, give her a chance to live, at the same time make sure that the security of the rest of Europe is preserved and that aggression cannot take place again.
Soviet military maneuvers near Berlin. By 1948, the honeymoon among the Allies was long over. The Soviets wanted a weak Germany under four-power control. America, Britain and France were secretly planning a new German state in their occupation zones. Spies told the Soviet military governor Vasily Sokolovsky about the plan.
Он собрал всех и сказал, что прочел нам
He gathered all of us together and read out an intelligence report.
данные разведки показали, что в Лондоне совершился
The report stated that a secret conference about Germany was held in London.
германскому вопросу.
He read out everything that was discussed in London.
В Лондоне.
Sir Brian Robertson, the British military governor, and his American counterpart, General Lucius D. Clay, had to implement the Western plans.
General Clay was the hardest working man I've encountered, no vacation. He skipped lunch because he considered that a waste of time. Instead, he had 20 cups of coffee and 2 packs of cigarettes a day. What impressed me particularly was his fantastic ability to absorb difficult questions that were quite outside of the framework of his experience. After all, he was a professional soldier.
The Allied Control Council met regularly in Berlin. Usually, as here, the proceedings followed a well-worn path. The American General Clay and his Western partners exchanged routine information with their Soviet counterparts. But on March 20th, 1948, Sokolovsky wanted more.
Начнем вежливо, тактично.
He spoke in a very tactful and polite fashion,
Очень сдержанно.
in a very restrained way.
Очень просим.
He said, "Could you please fill us in?
Как было?
Tell us what happened at the meeting in London."
Клей ответил, что...
Clay replied that they weren't going to look into it. Sokolovsky then asked what was the point of having a control council if they were not going to tell us what went on in London, and if they kept secret from us the various issues concerning Germany. Have we or haven't we got a control council?
The Russian just stood up, and he had about 5 or 6 of them on the left and the right of them, and they just walked out, which was not called for, because when they closed the meeting, it was always done in a professional manner. And the general just told everybody to stay put, because the meeting wasn't over.
The former Allies provoked each other. The West had no intention of budging from Berlin, but knew the Soviets wanted them out. They feared Stalin might risk war to achieve it. The Western Allies planned a currency reform in their zones. It would wipe out black market profiteers by making old currency valueless, and it would tie Germans to the West. Russians weren't told. May Day 1948. In the Soviet zone, Stalin had merged the socialist and communist parties. The new grouping, the Socialist Unity Party, was out in strength. There was even a side swipe at Winston Churchill. For the demonstrators, the real target was the city council, the Magistrat, which wanted to run all Berlin on Western lines.
The majority of the Berlin City Council, supported by the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, believed that with currency reform there would be an immediate upturn in the economy. In particular, there would be increased investment by entrepreneurs.
Die Mitglieder der SED im Magistrat
On the other hand, the Socialist Unity Party councillors saw it as a threat to the still incomplete nationalisation of property which had belonged to the big companies, to war criminals and to Nazi Party members. Generally, to all those whom the Socialist Unity Party blamed for supporting Hitler in 1933.
The stage was set for confrontation between the Socialist Unity Party and their pro-Western opponents. These were led by Ernst Reuter, whose family had once been forced to flee from Hitler. His election as mayor of all Berlin had been vetoed by the Russians.
Es allen klar wurde, dass der kommunistische Diktaturwille jedes Mittel benutzen wird, seine Macht im Schatten des russischen Imperialismus aufzurichten, da haben wir in Berlin.
It was a very tense atmosphere again, full of possibilities that the Russians would try to enforce their power in that part of the country, in the city of Berlin, of course, that maybe the family again would have to flee from dictatorship.
West Germans lined up for their new money, the Deutschmark. Each person could exchange 40 marks and only 40 marks. All other old money was worthless. The Soviets retaliated by issuing their own new currency, which they insisted would include all of Berlin.
Currency and political power were synonymous at that time. And therefore it was so important that the Western currency, the D-Mark, had to be introduced into West Berlin and not the Eastern German currency.
General Clay and the Western Allies were persuaded by Ernst Reuter to issue the new Deutschmark in West Berlin. The new Deutschmark, stamped with a B for Berlin, was introduced in the western sectors on June the 23rd. There were now two currencies in the city. Berliners discovered that the Western D-marks were worth more.
Many people from the West frequently traveled to the East and of course bought up what they could. East marks and West marks, if you can call them that, were usually 1 to 7 or 1 to 5. That is, we got 7 or 5 East German marks for 1 West mark. And as we found out later, it was a sellout, at least around Berlin.
The introduction of the new Western currency in Berlin infuriated the Soviets, who debated what to do next.
Sokolovsky picked up the special phone and rang Molotov. He said, "We're discussing these matters. What shall we do?" We all understood the seriousness of the situation. Molotov replied, "You're not planning to bring tanks out into the streets, are you?" Sokolovsky said, "No, not in the streets, but I'll move them closer to Berlin." "No, don't do that," Molotov said. "Let's wait a bit. If you bring in the tanks, you'll be accused of planning to seize the whole of Berlin, and they will bring out their tanks. It's better to resolve this issue by using diplomatic language."
The Soviets blocked all major road, rail and canal links between West Berlin and Western Germany. They made no concerted effort to seal every route, but delivery of the 12,000 tons of food and coal normally supplied by the West to Berlin every day was now impossible. The Soviets cut electricity supplies to factories and offices. West Berliners could do little. Only large power station had been dismantled for reparations by the Soviets in 1945. The Western Allies imposed a counter-blockade on the Soviet zone. Workers throughout the whole of Berlin faced unemployment and hardship.
First of all, it was a terrible shock. Wherever you went, everyone asked, "Oh my God, what will happen to us now?"
Stalin's purpose was clear: to force the Western Allies to change their policies or quit Berlin. In 1945, the Western Allies had made a written agreement with the Soviets. Planes could fly along 3 air corridors 20 miles wide to 2 Berlin airfields, Tempelhof and Gatow. Seaplanes could also set down on Lake Havel. The British responded to the challenge. They planned an airlift. Foreign Secretary Bevin put his weight behind the idea.
Physical suffering of 2.5 million people in Berlin to try and influence the Allies, the Western powers, in their treatment of the Germans, and to try to force us out is one which we are unable to accept.
General Clay, the American commander, didn't believe an airlift would work. He had wanted to test Soviet resolve by running an armed convoy through the blockade. Reluctantly, he agreed to pursue the airlift idea with Ernst Reuter.
Clay said that this would mean extreme hardship and how little we could bring in at first. And he asked Reuter point blank, "Do you think the Berliners will be able to take it?" Reuter quietly replied, "You take care of the airlift, I'll take care of the Berliners." And Clay said that was good enough.
He called up General LeMay and said, "General, we're going to haul coal into Berlin." Coal? General LeMay said. He said, "Yeah, we're going to keep this city alive."
The Berlin airlift began at the end of June. The Americans called it Operation Vittles. The British, Plain Fare. The airlift had to deliver 2,000 tons of supplies a day. Without it, West Berliners couldn't survive. They had coal for only 45 days and food for only 36.
The airlift began, which was welcomed with incredible enthusiasm. People had such confidence in it. It was really remarkable. People thought, why shouldn't it work? They dropped so many bombs on Berlin. They should be able to drop potatoes.
Bomben mir abgeworfen, da werden sie doch auch Kartoffeln abwerfen können.
Thousands of Berliners found jobs and one hot meal a day working for the airlift.
We were divided into work gangs, supervised by an American overseer. Each gang was ordered one by one to planes as they came in.
Go to the next plane, hieß es dann.
Each of the larger planes carried 9 tons.
We could unload each plane in roughly 7 minutes. That was 9 short tons of coal.
The British hired civilian operators.
There weren't many people in England that had any aeroplanes, but I was very lucky at the time, inasmuch that I actually owned 12 converted Halifax bombers. The government came along and said, look, can we do something with these aeroplanes? And I said, of course. But remember, we all thought that the Berlin airlift was only going to last 2 or 3 weeks, or there would have been a war.
America now raised the stakes by sending B-29 bombers, capable of carrying atom bombs, to Britain. The move was highly publicized.
These are the men whose nerve-wracking job it may be to fight their way through weather and obstruction. So grave is the crisis that General Clay is recalled to Washington to report on the situation. He is greeted by Secretary of the Army Royal and then is welcomed by Chief of Staff Omar Bradley. On his shoulders may rest the responsibility for peace or war, and the Commander-in-Chief at the White House awaits his appraisal of the most explosive situation yet in the struggle between East and West.
Clay argued once again that he be allowed to confront the Soviets with an armed convoy.
Now, if the Soviets stepped aside and the convoy went through, then peace would continue. If they chose not to let the convoy through, then it meant war. It was just that simple. And last thing in the world President Truman wanted to do was see our country get into another great war. We just come out of one.
So, no armed convoy, but more planes for the airlift.
Since I have been in Washington, I have been assured of an additional supply of C-54s, which carry 10 tons, to replace the 47s. And this will enable us to build our airlift up to 4,500 tons a day. This tonnage will enable us to maintain Berlin indefinitely while we try to find a peaceful solution to the Berlin problem.
In August, Stalin visited an air show near Moscow. He was confident that the Soviet blockade of Berlin's western sectors would be enough to force the Allies back to the negotiation table. But time wasn't necessarily on his side. The West's counter-blockade of coal, steel and machine tools was beginning to bite. When Western diplomats asked for talks, he agreed.
Stalin
Stalin was very calm. He smoked. He didn't walk about like he usually did. Normally, he would pace around like a cat in his soft boots. But this time, he stayed seated. He had no notes next to him. He said, the question is very important from an economic point of view. But this is not the most important issue. What is more important are the decisions you have taken in London. We insist that you should revoke these decisions, or at least postpone their implementation until we get together again to discuss the question of Germany.
He saw that Germany was going to be divided, with a strong Western Germany, supported by America in the West, and anyway being 3/4 of the total part of Germany, which would become an independent country, and he wanted to stop that.
In Berlin, the Western Allies and Soviets returned to the negotiating table. The Russians demanded the withdrawal of the Western Deutschmark from the city. They also applied pressure in the air corridors.
There's plenty of provocation. They used to carry out aerial maneuvers in the corridor or right alongside it. They'd be above you because we had a maximum altitude. And they go off firing military equipment, be buzzed and all that sort of thing.
The
come up and a yak would come head on with you, right nose to nose, and the last minute would peel off, or come up behind you so you couldn't see him and then come up over the wing. But didn't shoot.
Bad weather caused delays and accidents. The airlift was not delivering enough food, and virtually no coal had been stockpiled for the harsh winter to come.
Mein Berlin, du kannst nicht untergehen. Du wirst genauso schön wie einst erstehen. Denn die Lichter wieder schneller hoch und aus der Auen sehen, dann ist Berlin wie einst so schön.
Berliners knew they were living on the edge. Electricity came on for only 4 hours a day.
Es gibt kaum eine Stadt, die solchen Lebenswillen hat, drum kann Berlin nie untergehen.
Wir haben dann teilweise
We did the washing at night. Because I had a small baby, I had to boil the nappies and do the cooking.
nachts Windeln abgekocht und so weiter.
If we didn't have an electric iron, then we'd go to a neighbour and do the ironing together. It's always the same in bad times. People stick together through thick and thin.
The Soviet blockade didn't prevent West Berliners from moving about freely within the city. The eastern sector behind the Brandenburg Gate could be very enticing.
I often went across into East Berlin. If you wanted to go out, you had to go into the eastern sector. There were dance halls, there was music, there was electric lighting. The rooms were heated and normal peacetime conditions prevailed.
The Russians offered West Berliners the chance to buy food in the Soviet sector. Nearly 1 in 10 accepted. The Soviets didn't impose a complete blockade, but West Berliners who went to East Berlin were harassed.
We could get out by train, but were constantly checked here, there and everywhere by the Russians. They came into the station and I demanded our identity papers or searched our bags and rucksacks. You had the feeling that if a Russian didn't like the look of a German, he would take him away.
Tension among the former wartime allies was increasing. The city was splitting apart. On September the 6th, communist-led activists converged on a full meeting of the city council in East Berlin. They were looking for trouble.
These were not spontaneous outbursts from the people. They were, on the contrary, demonstrations, which party members and sympathizers had been ordered to attend. Their aim was to break up the old city council.
We wanted to begin the session, but Speaker Zur couldn't get it started because communist gangs had made it their business to be there. Word got around. We couldn't work there. Some people had already been beaten up, so we had to leave.
Councillors driven out of the city hall met in the safety of West Berlin. With them was Ernst Reuter, who now appealed to all Berliners to gather at the Reichstag to protest. Rias, radio in the American sector, spread the news.
Because of the lack of electrical power, we had loudspeaker wagons going through the street giving the news several times a day. They got a fine actor make a tape Berliner und Berlinerinnen, Ihre Stadt ist in Gefahr, your city is in danger. The people came. Hundreds of thousands of them came.
Das war eine Atmosphäre des Zusammenhalts.
This was a show of unity by the people of Berlin. There was nothing else in our heads but the thought, we stand united. We are against the Russians and we support the Western Allies.
Halten wir zusammen.
Nearly 300,000 Berliners, many from the east, assembled at the Reichstag.
The view of the Berlin politician, there was a possibility that the Western Allies might be ready to come to a compromise with the Russians, which would be a detrimental compromise for Germany. They rallied that meeting to demonstrate that the population of Berlin was decided to stand for their freedom and for democracy.
Heute ist der Tag, an dem nicht Diplomaten und Generäle reden und verhandeln. Heute ist der Tag, wo das Volk von Berlin seine Stimme erhebt. Ihr Völker in Amerika, in England, in Frankreich, in Italien, schaut auf diese Stadt und erkennt, dass ihr diese Stadt und dieses Volk nicht preisgeben dürft, nicht preisgeben könnt.
When the rally was over, the Soviet flag on the Brandenburg Gate was torn down. East Sector police and Soviet soldiers opened fire. 12 people were injured. 1 young Berliner was killed. And the day was not yet over. A delegation went to the Allied Control Council, where they feared a deal with Stalin to withdraw the Western D-Mark from Berlin was being hatched. The Allies got the message. The D-Mark stayed.
Main field was busier than ever this week as airlift traffic was suddenly bolstered by fresh squadrons. Here a group of valiant young pilots talk over the day's operations.
Mensch, bei dem Wetter willst du starten? Na klar, die Italiener warten auf wir.
The blockade and the airlift went on.
We flew everything. I mean, medical supplies, newsprint, but the coal was the biggest thing, and it was the biggest problem, too. The coal dust would seep in under the floors and the control cables, make it difficult to control the airplane. So we flew with our escape hatches out in the back to suck out the dust.
Big Easy 6-4, I have you in contact over the Tempelhof range. If you'll pick up a heading now to get you over the Planter Beacon, coming down very nice. Now you're starting to go a little bit above your glide path.
Every 45 seconds, airplanes from the West came over Kleinmachnow, over the High Party Academy, in order to land in Tempelhof.
216 degrees. You are now 1.5 miles from touchdown. You're approaching the trees and buildings. You're now on course, and you're now on your glide path. Very nice.
We were sitting around, the teachers of the history department and of others. I said, the Americans understand historical materialism better than we. And so we're looking at historical materialism better than we. Yeah, they understand that you have to have a basis of food and help before you can begin party education. The Americans understand historical materialism.
Airlift pilots could fly up to 3 missions every day. An American pilot brought his own 8mm movie camera.
I went back to Berlin to get this picture. Inside the barbed wire, kids came up on the other side of the barbed wire, looked at me in the uniform, came up and started talking to me. How many sacks of flour you got? You know, how's it going to be tomorrow? They got off the subject of flour very quickly, on the subject of freedom. They said, look, He said, someday we'll have enough to eat. Just give us a little. Just don't give up on us when the weather gets bad. We'll have enough. But if we lose our freedom, we may never get it back. And these kids were 8 to 14 years old. They blew my mind with their maturity and understanding of what was important.
Halverson promised the children that he would return with chewing gum and chocolate dropped from tiny parachutes.
Es war erstaunlich, was die alles mit ihren Flugzeugen hergebracht haben.
It was amazing all the things they brought over in their planes.
Das heißt, der eine Junge, der war dann auch hier, die mit diesen...
I still remember my youngest boy was there.
hatten dann kleine, wie kleine...
When American soldiers dropped little parachutes with sweets, chewing gum and chocolate.
Bisschen Schokolade, sowas.
Word of Halverson, the candy bomber, spread quickly. He was summoned to see his commanding officer.
He really chewed me out. And then he reached into the counter, pulled out a newspaper, and there on the front page was an airplane with parachutes coming out of it. He says, you almost hit a German newspaper man in the head with a candy bar in Berlin yesterday. And he's got this story all over the world. He says, the general read it and called me to find out what was going on. I didn't know anything about it. I'll never get promoted. Why didn't you tell me? I said, I didn't think you'd approve it, sir. He says, you're right. But the general thinks it's a good idea. Keep doing it.
For both East and West, radio was an important weapon in the propaganda war.
Es spricht Roman Kwalek.
Radio in the American sector, RIAS, was run by William Heimlich.
I introduced American broadcasting techniques on the theory that if the audience isn't there, you can't convince them of anything. So my number one priority was get people to listen. How do you get people to listen? You give them good, entertaining programs, solid news that they could depend upon.
Trotz ungünstiger Witterung und niedriger Wolkendecke vollzog sich auch heute der Lufttransportverkehr nach Berlin planmäßig. Am frühen Nachmittag trafen die ersten Skymaster-Maschinen mit je 8 Tonnen Steinkohle an Bord in Tempelhof ein.
A young Berlin dancer called Christina Olsen became a popular RIAS performer, and later Mrs. Heimlich.
I read the headlines, and then I would make fun of whatever the Russians or East Germans did. Das versteh ich nicht, dazu bin ich noch zu klein. Doch die Russen, die müssten doch das eigentlich verstehen. Which means I'm too little to understand all these happenings, but the public could certainly get it. And it became a very famous slogan in Berlin, and so I became the voice of Berlin.
Werden Sie am Sonntag wählen?
Ja, ja.
Und Sie?
Selbstverständlich. Aber natürlich werde ich wählen.
Darf ich Sie auch noch schnell fragen, ob Sie am Sonntag wählen
Aber
werden?
selbstverständlich werden wir wählen.
In December 1948, West Berliners voted for a new council to run their half of the city. The Socialist Unity Party, which dominated the old council in the Soviet sector, boycotted the elections.
Wir sind im Moment als Stadt gespalten.
For the moment, we are a divided city. There is nothing we can do about it.
Unser Leben.
Our survival now depends on developing extremely strong ties with West Germany.
Bekommen.
Ernst Reuter was now mayor, with Louisa Schroeder as his deputy, but only in one half of Berlin. For the American garrison in Berlin and for General Clay, Christmas entertainment was provided by Bob Hope and by the great Tin Pan Alley composer Irving Berlin.
You know, you've got the name wrong. It's Irving Jones.
Irving Jones?
Yes, I changed it. Anything over here named Berlin, they cut up into sectors.
Not long ago, a group we called the Air Corps helped win the war and took a bow. Not long ago, we cheered the fighting Air Corps. Let's see what's happened to them now. Operation Vittles is in the way, and rolling wheat and hay, and everything's okay. Operation Vittles, as in the night we go, we won't forget to blow against the world.
Operation Vittles, the American code name for the airlift, was working at last, thanks to an unusually mild winter. On Easter Sunday 1949, a record 13,000 tons was airlifted in 24 hours. The gamble had worked. Berlin could be supplied indefinitely by air.
We lived
at Karlshorst and could hear the noise of the aeroplanes, which delivered everything, including chocolate and Christmas presents. We couldn't match it. We were poor, and the West was rich. And of course, this crazy blockade was bound to fail.
The Soviets had failed to drive the British, Americans and French out of Berlin. The Allied counter-blockade was hurting the Soviet zone. On May 12, 1949, Stalin called it quits.
As midnight nears, tension mounts at the British frontier control post. Familiar with the old Russian habit of changing their minds when it suits them, seasoned campaigners could not quite grasp this new mood of cooperation. As on the stroke of 12, the barrier goes up and a British jeep leads the race into Berlin.
Many people thought the ending of the Berlin blockade meant an end to the Cold War.
I returned home after midnight, having taken the S-Bahn from Ostkreuz to Neukölln. When we crossed the boundary between the two sectors, everything was bathed in light. It was like a dream.
Freude. Weiter nichts.
Sheer joy. Nothing else. We had done it. It does work with the West.
Und es geht doch mit dem Westen.
That was so very important. The West has won.
Der Westen hat gesiegt.
It was General Clay's time to go back home. After a goodbye parade, he paid a final visit to Berlin.
So then he asked me to go with him to the final farewell ceremony at City Hall, and Adenauer and all the top German officials had been flown in. That was a very impressive farewell ceremony, and as so often, nobody had thought of providing a separate microphone for the interpreter. This happened to me time and again, which meant I had to lean over practically cheek to General Clay to speak into the microphone. And in the strong light, I could see that there were tears in his eyes.
I shall not use the English word goodbye, but rather try to say to you, Auf Wiedersehen.
The day General Clay said Auf Wiedersehen, the head of the future West German Republic, Konrad Adenauer, addressed Berliners.
Und erfüllt von tiefer Dankbarkeit für euren Kampf, für euer Leid, für eure Geduld, die jetzt zum Siege geführt hat.
The Cold War period in Berlin was really the core, the root of post-war democracy in Germany. There was a growing feeling that the Germans, after all, can be satisfied to accept democracy as their own ways of living and to become part of the Western world.
Сам этот берлинский кризис привел, конечно...
The Berlin crisis, on reflection, resulted in a division of Europe. The government in West Germany was created, and 2 weeks later, on our side, the German Democratic Republic was born. That division went right across Germany.
In April 1949, British Foreign Secretary Bevin's dream of a strategic alliance between Western Europe and North America came true with the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty.
The overall success of the Berlin Airlift was, first of all, it persuaded a lot of very frightened people throughout Europe that they had to come into the Atlantic Alliance, which provided the security for the general feeling that we are safe in spite of these very much larger Russian forces which were next door.
August 29th, 1949. The Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb. The American nuclear monopoly was over. The world was now split down the middle by two competing superpowers. At its heart lay a divided Germany and a divided Berlin.